Um, as I mentioned in today's service, one of the things that I thought we could do this year is to talk about, learn about the story, the history of us and where we began. And thought the place to begin is the creation of the Christian scriptures. And I divided that into 4 parts, sort of chronologically. And then I want to start with the earliest written text that we have from the New Testament, the Pauline epistles, talk about the Gospels, talk about the non-Pauline epistles, and then finally, just for fun, just because I think we don't ever spend a lot of time talking about them, the texts that almost made the cut into the New Testament, some of which have a lot to offer, but because they were not considered to be I won't say worthy enough, but we're not included. We've sort of lost a lot of that to history and our own understanding. A long time ago, a friend of mine, in teaching a class about the history of the church, said, in order to understand the church, you need to understand 2 things. 1, things happen very slowly in the history of the church. And 2, it happened all over the place in different ways. So, it's sort of, there's not one story of the history of the church. There's 1,000 stories. Come on in. There's 1,000 stories of the history of the church where different places and different people experienced it in different ways. I would add, sort of as a little bit of addendum to that there's still so much of the history of the early church that is conjecture based upon archaeological evidence. We don't have a book of the history of the church. What we have are fragmentary documents, oral histories, legends, stories, all of which we have to then distill out of to try to find some sense of what might be true, realizing that almost every time there's an asterisk that comes after it that says, well, this scholar thinks this or this scholar thinks that. And so everything that I say today, you will be able to find a credible biblical scholar who will argue against it. And that's not anything wrong, it's just the way in which we have understanding of history. I'm going to leave these handouts down here. And now I have to keep running it down. And the perfect example of this is the figure Paul. We know very little about a person who we consider to be one of the most significant figures of the apostolic age, that first generation of the church. And part of this because in the letters that he wrote, he included very little autobiographical information. Mostly because he didn't feel the need to do it, because he was writing to people who knew him. And that the other source of biographical information is the book, the Acts of the Apostles, which is sort of the second follow-up book to the Gospel of Luke. And while there's a lot in there then about Paul and Paul's story, because that biography is questionable, 1, because it's written later, and 2, because the depictions of Paul in that story don't always seem to gel really nicely with Paul's own description of himself. And in addition, the figure of Paul in the Acts of the Apostles seems so much larger than life that there are a lot of academics who look at it a little skeptically. So a perfect example of this is in the book of Acts, Paul is this dynamic, charismatic speaker. He seems almost like he's super heroic in nature. He's preaching and converting thousands of people per sermon. I mean, he really almost looks like this very sort of quasi-messianic figure in the book of Acts. Paul himself says that he is unattractive and has a highly annoying voice. And that one of the reasons why he actually writes letters and has other people give them is because he thinks they'll take it better. This is not to mention the fact that also he appears to be a bit irascible in his own letters, and just to kind of like hammer this home, as his occupation, he's a leather worker or a tent maker. It's a little unclear based on the words that are being used, but if you have any familiarity with how leather was made back in those days, they would take hides, scrape them, and then cure them in a combination of cow urine and cattle brain to then go ahead and make real leather out of it. Now that face that you're making right now Just imagine a guy who's working with that all day and then says, hey, can I talk to you about Jesus? It's kind of a little bit of a hard sell. Now, on the other hand, he may have used his occupation as a way to engage people. People come to his shop, his tent up in a market somewhere. He sort of traveled around selling his wares, and he would engage people who were his customers on the topic of spirituality and Christianity. What do we know about him that is fairly credible? Well, number one, he's from the city of Tarsus, which is located in modern-day Syria. He's Jewish. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. Some scholars have said, okay, what is a Jewish person doing living in Syria? He may have been part of a group of Jews who were taken into slavery in the past and then were released from slavery in Syria. There's historical record that says that those individuals, when they were made free, were given Roman citizenship after that, which would connect up with the fact that Paul himself does say, come on in, does talk about being a Roman citizen. This will actually factor a lot into his death. We know that he's a Pharisee, which is a group that appears frequently in the Gospels as sort of this rival faction of Judaism up against Christianity. Pharisees were very much a grassroots group. I sometimes say that probably the best modern parallel, and I mean no aspersions against this group, is like the Promise Keepers, that you have this like lay-led, very intense group about living a faithful life by rigid adherence to a set of laws. And rather than like cultic practices on holy days, that faith was really meant to be lived every single day as much as possible. With a strong lay accountability and leadership for that. You can see why that group sounds a lot like Christianity, which is probably one of the reasons why it was sort of juxtaposed against Christianity more than other kinds of Judaism was. He talks about being a persecutor of Christians in his letters. Paul is depicted in the book of Acts as being someone who participates in the persecution of Christians, most notably, when he sort of appears on the scene in the book of Acts, in the martyrdom of Stephen, the first deacon, or one of the deacons, and the first martyr of the Christian faith. And it says, in this sort of weird way that it kind of indemnifies Paul against actually killing Stephen, the book of Acts says that he held the coats while everybody else threw the rocks. So he's like an accessory to murder. He's not actually the murderer. That's probably a little kindness that the narrator is trying to provide for him. We do know from his own letters that he at some point had a religious experience in which he saw Jesus. He says in his letters that the Lord revealed himself to me. In the book of Acts, that story is expanded to the story of him going to Damascus, having this vision of Jesus where he says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Just a little bit about the names. Saul is the Hebrew name. Many Hebrew people took a Roman name for their Roman citizenship. I tried to think about like the best example of how this sort of works, and I would say, if you've ever met somebody who's from another land, who's got a name that's unfamiliar, so they might say, my name is this, but go ahead and call me Joe. It's sort of the anglicized nickname that might be. Saul is the Hebrew name. Paul is not his conversion name, it's his Roman name, Paulus. But in any case, he says, Saul, while you're persecuting me, Paul is struck blind. He goes and finds a Christian to go ahead and talk to him about Jesus, heals him of his blindness. And then Paul understands out of that experience that he is meant to be a figure that goes and brings the story of Christianity to non-Jewish people, which at the time was a very bold leap forward in the nature of the faith. Because up to that point, Christianity was sort of this esoteric Jewish sect. And Paul strongly advocates for spreading this to Hellenized Greeks and others living in Asia Minor and elsewhere. And the response from the first generation church is mixed on this point. Some people are opposed to the idea. Others say, well, in order for you to do that, you really should become Jewish first, because this is really a Jewish thing. So we should let Christians come, if people want to come from outside Judaism, become Christians, should become Jewish first and do all the Jewish rites first, including circumcision, and then become a Christian. And while they're at it, go ahead and observe all these various Jewish rites in terms of dietary laws and everything else, holidays, whatever. Paul does not agree with that assessment. He thinks that you can become a Christian without becoming a Jew first. This would actually be one of the major controversies of that first generation of the church that plays itself out in the letters of Paul to these various churches. Now, we know from the book of Acts and from some sense of Paul's own writings that he took 3 missionary trips in a very short period of time, really a window of about 10 years. The most prominent of which were first the second one, in which he actually establishes a lot of the churches that the letters get written to, and then a final one which would have him end up being arrested for several years. After that third missionary trip, he goes to Jerusalem once more. It looks like he went to Jerusalem maybe 5 times in his life as an adult Christian. One of those incidences is when he went where they had this council in Jerusalem to discuss the issue of Gentiles. We don't know how that conversation went, interestingly enough. There's all sorts of stories about how he and Peter might have gotten their dukes up and had a little rope-a-dope action between the two of them, 2 blue-collar guys kind of throwing down. Some people have said, well, Paul must have prevailed because Gentiles made it into the church. But actually, there's nothing to suggest that. There's a lot to suggest that maybe Paul failed at it and really went back out and tried to make more of a case of it later. But on his last trip to Jerusalem, he was arrested for being a rabble-rouser. They threatened to flog him. He said, I'm a Roman citizen. Roman citizens cannot be flogged under imperial law. And people said, okay, well, that's debatable. Let's go ahead and send you back towards Rome in order to decide what your actual fate's going to be. He actually ended up spending several years in Caesarea Philippi. He wrote letters there. Eventually went to Rome during the time of Nero and was there probably for the fire that consumed Rome. And then sometime after that was killed. And again, the story is that he was beheaded. Killed at the same time as Peter, his rival, who was crucified because he was not a Roman citizen. Now, in those 3 missionary trips, he is creating churches and visiting churches. And he's sort of an itinerant preacher of sorts. He would come to a place, he would meet with people, he would stay in their homes, he would create these house-based churches, many times being sponsored by women, as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the figure Lydia from one of my children's sermons. And then he would leave, and then he would have correspondences with churches as he would hear about how they're doing. And some of those correspondences were sort of positive in nature. Hey, love you guys, just thought I'd write to you. Other of them, and this is often the case, were negative in nature. He would hear something troubling about the church in question, and then would go and write to them saying, hey, I've heard this is going on. These are the mistakes you're making. This is what you should be doing. I'm very upset about this, so on and so forth. This sort of brings me to, I think, one of the more extraordinary things about the Pauline epistles, which is that these letters were written to a specific people at a specific time for a specific purpose. They were not generalized letters. If you could imagine, and this is obviously a hypothetical that's not accurate because there are no envelopes, but let's say that Paul was writing 2 of his letters, Church of Galatia, Corinthians, 1 Corinthians. And somehow, as he's sitting there at the desk with his secretary as everybody else, he accidentally switches the letters, and the Corinthians letter gets mailed to the Galatians, and the Galatians mail gets mailed to the Corinthians. It would have made no sense to them. Church in Galatia got along great with Paul. He's going to open this up and be like, I'm so disappointed in you, and I'm really upset with you about everything that you're doing. It's all really wrong. I can't believe you're listening to these people. And they'd be like, what on earth? And then Corinthians will get this and be like, I love you all and all your great work that you're doing. And they would be like, well, that's weird because I would have thought he'd been really mad about this, but okay. And so even though that incident would have made it totally ridiculous to have one person read the other letter, we read all of them like they're for us. And I think that's some of the brilliance of Paul in his writing, is that he writes these things and somehow they continue to speak to generation after church, even though they are specific to the context of what he's writing at the moment. I will say also that in addition to being a Pharisee, Paul also appears to be educated in Stoic philosophy. He uses a lot of Stoic terminology, and he uses a lot of Stoic arguments. And he may have done this as a way to appeal to a Gentile crowd. You know, he's going to speak in their religious or philosophical language to explain what he's doing. Now, you note that if you look at this, I've been talking about the Pauline epistles versus the non-Pauline epistles. So there are 14 letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament. Of those, 13 are really attributed to Paul, and there's the Epistle of the Hebrews, which has no actual identifiable author. So we sort of take that one and say, well, we called all the other epistles Paul, we'll call that one too. No one thinks that Paul wrote the Epistle of the Hebrews. It's so far afield from what Paul tended to do. But, and this is the part where we get to the asterisks about who believes what when, of those 14, there are 7 that scholars believe quite strongly were written by Paul or were read or were spoken to as secretary, who then either just wrote it all down or contributed as an author to the letters. There are several that are debatable. And then the remainder of those, people say, no, I'm sorry, Paul did not write these letters. Now you might say, okay, how do we guess that? What's that based upon? If you look actually at my chart here, you'll see there's 3 columns. The middle column actually comes from a survey that was taken in 2012 of New Testament scholars, and they basically said, yes, unsure, no. What do you guys think? And then they kind of tabulated the votes. So for example, Romans, the 109 people surveyed, all 109 people think Paul wrote Romans. So it is for 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians. Then you get to Ephesians, and it's like, only of all those, only 39 thought he did, 28 aren't sure, and 42 say no. That's one of the debatable ones. Then you get down to ones like, 2 Thessalonians, that's a maybe. 1 Timothy, now you're starting to get into people saying, you know what, it's very likely that Paul did not write those. I mean, over about half the people say no, another quarter of them say maybe, only a quarter say yes, and then again you get down to Hebrews and you get no. Why the variance? Well, it's based on multiple things. First of all, word choice. The words that are used with regularity versus letters that have words that Paul never used in any of his other letters. Second, grammar and sentence structure. So, for example, I, Rob Baldwin, have, and I'm well aware of this, a tendency to overuse semicolons. When I'm writing, I tend to use no idea, semicolon, second idea. I like the pairing for whatever reason. I also like the Oxford comma because I think that that's good grammar. And I put 2 spaces after every period because that's how I learned it when I was taking typing on an actual honest-to-God typewriter. So if you were to get given an article for the newsletter and somebody were to say, Rob wrote this, and there's no Oxford commas and only 1 space after the period, you would say, you know what? I have questions about whether or not Rob actually wrote this because it does not match his writing style. In addition, there's the straight up theological content. So for example, we know that Paul seems to have a fairly egalitarian opinion about women in the church. He, in fact, even has women reading his letters in these places. He references women being leaders of the church. Well, then if you have another letter that says women should have no position of teaching and authority over men in the church, you're like, okay, I thought he actually liked women in the church. Maybe this is written by somebody else. And if you're the kind of person, and I have actually read these articles, or somebody says, no, let me explain how this works. Because he really wrote this, but he totally changed his language and his grammar and his word choices and his theology and his opinions about women and everything else because of this, and this. You're working really hard to make Paul be the author of that letter to the point where you're probably distorting ideas, data, to fit a doctrine where you feel like there has to be a univocality to the epistles, that Paul has to write all of them, Because if Paul did it, then they're no longer valid, or whatever reason you might have for it. But there's a lot of evidence to suggest that while people might attribute a letter to Paul, that he didn't write those. Then you might say, wait a minute, that seems really deceitful. Well, it wasn't quite considered to be that big a thing back in the day. We'll have the same issue with the authorship of the Gospels. For people to say, you know what, I'm going to write this, but I'm going to say that Paul wrote it. Yes, they're borrowing his credibility, but it was sort of seen as being like if I'm a student of Paul, or I come from a church that Paul created, or I'm just a fan of Paul's. Think about how we talk about how paintings are from, this school or that school, the Rubens school or whatever. And you say, well, wait a minute, you say this painting's from the Rubens school, but you make it sound like Rubens did it, but he didn't. He's actually just one of his students. And you're like, yeah, but that's how it was. Well, same thing here. So I'm going to focus today, though, on the letters that we believe Paul actually wrote, because for the most part, they're consistent in their vocabulary and theology and word choice. And interestingly enough, the order that they appear in the New Testament is not the order in which they were written. Based on internal evidence, the earliest ones would be a letter like Galatians or Philippians. But I will say that I did put the notes in by the order of the New Testament, but we're going to hop around a little bit. So one of the things, as I mentioned before, as we'll look at Galatians to start with, is that relationship between Gentile Christians and Jewish law, and especially circumcision. As a weird topic, and it's really funny because you don't want to go into a church service at a sermon and be like, hey, today I'm going to talk a lot about hacking off part of a man's reproductive anatomy for my children's sermon. But it comes up all the time. And this is the part where people are like, oh, let's talk about homosexuality in the church. I'm sorry, homosexuality was rarely ever mentioned in the epistles of Paul. You, at best, maybe have 2 references, and those are debatable. There's 17 specific references to adult male circumcision. This was by far the biggest ethical issue. He talks about it constantly, and it is thankfully no longer an issue in the church because he addressed it so much. But let's be honest, if you're talking about obstacles for conversion to Christianity, that's a big one. In fact, actually, there's a thought that one of the reasons why Gentiles flocked to Christianity was that they actually appealed, there's something that was appealing about the ethical structure of Judaism, but let's just say that the gate to get in was a little high. So they're like, all right, I don't want to do that. Tell me about this version of Judaism, because that seems a little cooler. But in the book of Galatians, Paul talks specifically about this, and one of the ideas about why it would be earlier is that he really is talking a lot about how Gentiles should be accepted into Christianity, when that actually really became the common acceptance in Christianity at about 48 CE, which is the time of one of the councils in Jerusalem. So the fact that he keeps talking like this is still an issue suggests that this letter takes place prior to the more across-the-board decision to accept Gentiles in there. But he talks a lot about the law. He talks a lot about how Gentiles are adopted into the family of Abraham. And he talks about how now we're living underneath this new law, not all the Jewish laws, but the law of Christ. We also know that this is a letter written not to one church in Galatia, but to a whole group of churches that were in that area. So this is a little bit more of a generalized letter, but it is also extremely positively. Is one of the letters that was extremely influential in the establishment of Protestantism, especially Lutheran Protestantism. Luther himself said he thought the letter to Galatia was written to him specifically because he struggled so much about, even underneath Christian law, about how he was supposed to live, and worrying about how if he didn't follow all these rules, he wouldn't be able to get into heaven because he wouldn't be able to be righteous enough to do that. And there's so much in the book of Galatians that is about how we don't get in because we follow the laws. We get in because we've been welcomed in by God through Jesus Christ, that it's his righteousness, not ours, that matters. Philippians is actually considered to be multiple letters, and again, this is all about context because he seems to hop around a lot in the book of Philippians. So there's a belief there's actually 3 letters that were all kind of brought together at a single time. He's writing from prison. He talks about he's writing from prison. He may be in Rome. He might be in Caesarea Philippi. We're not sure. He doesn't say. Again, he goes after what he calls Judaizers, which are sort of super Jewish Christians who are in conversation with these churches. So what happened is that Paul would come through, he'd preach, then you get one of these very Jewish Christians who would go through and preach, and some of the church would be like, oh, Paul's cool, but also this guy might be right, let's go with him. And Paul's like, no. And he takes a very hard antagonistic position against Judaizers, to the point where he makes some fairly off-color and crass jokes about them. But what he really wants to talk to them about is how they should be living with humility. There's a strong emphasis on the humble servant nature of Christ and how that should be a model for Christians today. All right, so now let's hop back around to some of the more later ones. I mentioned Corinthians. The First Corinthians and then Second Corinthians, he wrote 3, maybe 4 letters to the church in Corinth. One possibly before First Corinthians. The first letter that we have, so we call that one First Corinthians. There's a letter that's lost, sometimes called the Solemn Epistle. And then the letter that comes after that one, because it's the second one we have, we call it Second Corinthians. I know that sounds terribly confusing, and for that, on behalf of biblical scholars everywhere, I apologize. We know this other letter exists between first and second because Paul references the first 2 letters. He wrote the first one, then he says, then I wrote another one, which was even sort of more critical. He talks about how really hurt he is in that other letter, and then he talks about 2 Corinthians, where he continues to complain about how hurt he is in this one. But what he's writing to in the church of Corinth, and this is the part where, by the way, if you ever hear somebody say, you know what, we should be more like the apostolic church. Let's get back to that old-time religion and those good old days of the church where everything was just perfect, not all this fruppery that we got going on right now. Just tell them to read Corinthians, because Paul's writing, he says, listen, you guys are jealous of each other, you have rivalries, you have immoral behavior. He talks about things like, and all this is kind of fascinating for me, but people were coming to take the Eucharist. And what they were doing was they were bringing their own food. So they're brown bagging the Eucharist, basically, because it was kind of a meal. And then what would happen is that you would have one person bring in something really nice. So a little artesian bread, a little fancy bottle of wine, maybe a little oil. And then person number 2 is like, I've got a cracker, and I've got this Mad Dog 2020 that I bought from a hobo, and that's what I brought with me here. And so the obvious disparity, economically speaking, do they even have Mad Dog 2020 anymore? I have no idea. The obvious Boone's Mill. We'll go with Boone's Mill. So this obvious disparity between the two experiences in the Eucharist, the meal of Christ, was highlighting the differences people had in their personal lives. And he said, you know what, the Eucharist is no place for us to have highlighted our differences, especially economically speaking. There is in 1 Corinthians, back to the argument about women, there is a passage at the end where he criticizes women teaching in the church. A lot of scholars believe that is an interpolation, which is a piece that was added to later on. And they believe that because it flies again in the face of all the rest of his theology. So again, this passage, this portion, which is really sort of disconnected, like it sort of changes gears very suddenly. By the way, let's talk about women for a minute. Seems so out of place, they think that it was an addition put on by somebody else who's looking to kind of coalesce the theologies between the different works. He is also extremely critical to them about their refusal to accept the notion of the resurrection. There were a lot of questions about how the resurrection worked. Were people who died before Jesus came back, would they get the resurrection? And then also apparently they had the practice of baptizing the dead. Like somebody would die and they hadn't been baptized yet because baptism was this long, lengthy process. So they'd be like, you know what? Let's get this guy covered here. And they would baptize the dead. Paul would be like, there's no point in baptizing the dead. That's meaningless. Paul then had a second letter which continues to be critical of how the Corinthians are behaving. Paul spends a lot of time asserting his authority because, and this is an interesting kind of problem with Paul that a lot of people point to, Paul never met Jesus. Never had a word with Jesus. We don't know if Paul knew anything about Jesus' life outside the crucifixion. He makes no references to any biographical information about Jesus whatsoever outside the crucifixion story. But he claims apostleship, which was a title that was given to the original 12 students of Jesus Christ, one of whom was then replaced when Judas sort of left the herd and they brought in the new guy. Anybody remember his name? Anybody remember the name of the replacement apostle? It's Matthias. I don't confuse. Okay. But Paul's like, you know what? I too am an apostle. Jesus appeared to me. I've got a mission. And so he does spend some time in 2 Corinthians really trying to firmly establish his bona fides. He also, interestingly enough, and again, everything old is new again, or whatever the way it might be, he also asks for money. This is a fundraising letter. At the time, Jerusalem is going through a horrific famine. There's tremendous hunger and poverty. And he tries to raise money from Corinth. He's trying to take up a huge collection that he's going to deliver to the church in Jerusalem, saying, hey, all this money is coming from Gentile Christians. Aren't they one of us? Look, they're so much one of us that they're giving out of their generosity to help you. And then finally, two left. Romans is by far the longest. It's at the front of the New Testament. That is because this is the one letter written to a church that does not know him. He's anticipating going to Rome. He's writing a letter that will go ahead of him. And this is sort of his letter of introduction. Romans is by far his systemic theological work. Here I am. Here's who I am. Here's what I think. And it's this breakdown of his belief in Christ. He talks about corruption. He talks about justification again, that whole sense of being righteous through Jesus Christ. And he talks about how Christian faith should transform believers into a new life. It is by far the most self-contained, encapsulated notion of Pauline faith, which is one of the reasons why it's at the front, even though it might be one of the later letters that was written. And then finally, I don't know, I say this wrong. It's not Philemon, it's Philemon. I got that wrong once. I'll tell you a quick story. I think I told you the story before, that I was in church once and I was doing the children's sermon. I talked about the book of Philemon. And there was this guy who will go nameless, Schwaller, who was this scholar and part of the university community in Lawrence. He actually taught elsewhere, but he's still part of that. And he gets up to do his reading as the lector, and he says, "Far be it from me to correct our beloved rector, but here is a reading from the book of Philemon." And I was like, you son of a gun. And I got my phone out as he's reading it. I'm like looking it up, and I'm like, dang it, he's right. I've been pronouncing it wrong this entire time. And then I had to get my sermon and be like, all right, I was wrong, you're right. And I'm humble enough to admit that. Philemon's a little problematic. It's the shortest of them. It's even broken down into chapters. It is a letter written by Paul when he's in prison, again, possibly while he was in Caesarea Philippi, to Philemon, a wealthy Christian, possible bishop in Colossae, so possibly the Colossians letters. Paul is there with a runaway slave named Onesimus. He's converted Onesimus to Christianity, and Onesimus is being returned to his owner, this Christian, Philemon, and Paul's including this letter saying, I want you to receive Onesimus as your brother in Christ. Now that's the extent of the letter. Where it becomes problematic for Christian history is that at no point does Paul say Onesimus was right in running away because slavery was wrong. He does not instruct Philemon to free him, but merely treat him as a brother in Christ. So whether or not that's implied is ambiguous. But he also speaks and says, finally, that Onesimus should go back. So this book was used as a justification in American history for slavery. After all, Paul didn't say slavery was wrong. And in fact, this book was read frequently to slaves in the context of worship services they would have to go to as slaves to say, Paul, the apostle of Jesus, says that if you run away, you should come back. Which is a diabolical distortion of the intent of this letter. It's very clear that Paul wants Onesimus to have a different relationship with Philemon. But since it's not so explicitly spelled out what that means, in that ambiguity, Christians misuse this to advocate for slavery. And so Philemon has a bit of a dark mark on it as a result. When it only comes up like once in the lectionary, and I'm always like, oh, here we go. So I've been talking now for, almost 45 minutes. I've got 15 minutes left. That's a whirlwind tour here, and I'm sure you have a million questions. I'm going to ask that you use the microphone here to ask those questions so they'll come across on the online service. Are there any questions?
Just a comment?
Sure. Okay, here you go.
I'm not being on this broadcast. The total number does not always add up to 109.
I noticed that as well, and my only take on that, because I had the same question, was that there might be people who refuse to answer at all, period, or that Mark Twain might be right. There are three kinds of people in the world: liars, damn liars, and statisticians. So I too wondered why the math didn't always work out in terms of this survey.
Sometimes it adds up to 110. Next to the last one's 110.
I don't have answers to this question,
Okay,
unfortunately, but I noticed it as well. I think the extant is still there, but it's entirely possible that some of them may have said, you know what, I'm doubling down on my vote here. I can't explain it there. So
Doubling, yes, that would do it.
other questions? Yes, Carol.
So my knowledge of Paul Saul comes from teaching art history about this Roman period, and the imagery comes back to me. And I remember making a statement, which was not based on your lectures or anything else, but what I intuited, that really because Paul was a Roman, we can understand the stronghold of Christianity in this era that you speak about, the common CE 48 thereabouts, right, where the Roman Empire had the infrastructure to spread the knowledge of Christianity.
Sure.
So it's kind of the church and state, and not connected, but the infrastructure managed to move this somewhat sequestered sect of religion into a very large world, the largest world known at that time. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I think Paul definitely took advantage of the sea travel that was present in the Mediterranean, the roads, the mail service that all existed. I think all of those things allowed him to be able to communicate in a way that if you were out sort of in the hinterlands where the Gospels take place, they didn't quite have all of that built into it. And again, you also had communities that were able to then kind of gather and make space, and for whatever reason, you think about the Hellenized world, it was a very multicultural, sort of polytheistic world. We see stories about that in the Acts of the Apostles. There was definitely this hunger and interest in other religions. And Paul's way of communicating about Christianity became incredibly appealing for people as a way to shape one's life that perhaps some of the other philosophical or religious traditions didn't quite give them. And so you sort of see, and again, the way he sort of writes is a way where he's clearly introducing Judaism, introducing Christianity, but introducing this whole idea to a non-Jewish establishment. But I think you're right. He took advantage of the society of his day and all the ways that people could communicate socially in order to do that. Now, he got shipwrecked a couple of times in there too. I didn't mention that in his stories, but his capacity to travel throughout the Roman Empire, the use of a uniform language, also facilitated all of that. So you have a language, so you have people, he wrote all of it in Koine Greek, which everybody understood because that was part of the linguistic structure of the time. All that, I think, helped with his work.
I have one question. You made a comment earlier that he had written a letter that was to be sent ahead so he would be introduced to that congregation.
Right.
And it seems to me that means that there must have been some kind of, this is the wrong word, postal service that he could give it to somebody and that they had fast ways of getting
Right.
communications across the empire.
Yeah, my sort of sense, or probably something kind of akin to the Pony Express in my own head, where he's taking his own time, he's staying with people, he's visiting with them, he's building them up as Christians, but either his own sort of proteges or some sort of structure was more expedited so that it would be able to get there before he arrived. Now we know he traveled with other people. Acts talks about it. He talks about his own letters. But yeah, the fact that he writes this in anticipation, it's not like he sort of handed over and said, I'm going to wait outside, you read that, and I'm going to come in. There was this idea that while he might have been sort of leisurely going along, talking to churches, doing his work, all the while a dedicated communicator, whether or not that was somebody specific to him or some sort of mail structure, was going faster. That seems to be implied in that kind of concept. Yeah.
Rob, the question I pose to you is one that I think we've been struggling with for this generation, and it's really coming to a head, is how do we find authority in Scripture when we're coming out of a Protestant and somewhat Calvinistic influenced background at times, where the Scriptures looked at it as every word has some kind of meaning of equal weight, compared to, say, the Jewish tradition, where you have Torah, but then you have the writings, and you have the history, and you have the prophets. And so what I think you're teasing us with here is that maybe we as Christians need to redefine how we understand authority. So can you run with that as a
Sure.
question?
You were talking earlier, Carol, about art. I remember seeing these paintings, and it has Paul writing, and then sort of hovering is this sort of angelic hand, literally on the hand of the pen as it writes, so that we understand the sort of divine inspiration of this. One, it's kind of indefensible because we don't have the letters that were specifically written. What we have are copies of copies of copies of copies that have been hand transcribed over the generations. And if you've ever played the game Telephone, you know that you can't even get one right sentence in a youth group to go around a circle, much less a letter handwritten over generations to different people in biodegradable paper. That's just, it's hard to defend that. Paul, he was a student of the Torah. He went to the Gamaliel school. He understood that there was debate, and he uses, again, some of that rhetoric to help with that. I think that, not to get too far down this trundle path, but questions of authority in the church have always sort of vacillated based on history and tradition. So, do you have the institutional authority of the church, which is to say it's doctors, the certain group of theologians, it's clergy, it's papacy, who speak with a sort of divinely inspired notion. So you might say, well, everything that Rob says in a sermon must be correct because Rob's that guy. Please don't think that. Or you sort of become anti-authoritarian of sort of human institutional authority and say, well, the text itself then must be the ultimate authority, which then leads you into, again, some very shaky ground because you have all the issues about Scripture. Or, let me make this pitch for Episcopalianism, or Anglicanism as a whole, you adopt a semi-fluid notion of authority in which you have multiple authoritative sources, whether or not that's Scripture, the teachings of past authority figures, which we might broadly call tradition, and also just your own common sense and what your intelligence has revealed to you about the world around you, and say, okay, out of those three sources, I must then, in the context of the Christian community, try to ascertain the truth. Not fact, which is going to be ultimately extremely elusive, but something that is true insofar as I can find it to be of a pedagogical, theological, spiritual benefit to us. Understanding then that the truth that I might hold, because let me honestly, if you ever want to understand this concept, become a priest, preach sermons when you're 30, jump forward 23 years, preach those sermons, and then go back to the first ones and be like, oh Lord, that's a baby priest right there. Holy cow, that bright-eyed, arrogant little son of a, you adapt and you grow and you change as time goes by. And I feel like that is actually this living, vibrant, prayerful, spirit-filled kind of existence that is like, I don't need one person to tell me it and then lock it into place. Because at that point, that rigidity, just to use my own agricultural metaphor, it feels very Jesus-like of me. I've seen this a lot in trees around here, okay? You got two trees. One tree is super rigid. It's a hardwood. And then you have like a softwood, like a willow. And then a strong breeze blows by. Which one sustains the breeze better? Because one of them is going to bend and flow with the wind, and the other one is going to knock the power out in the rectory again. And, the problem with rigid theological ideas is that they're oftentimes very vulnerable to challenge and hardship. And then and then you're just like, well, I can't face reality then. I remember, I swear to God, this is true. I'm in my first year of seminary, Old Testament 1, so first day, first class, whatever. And there's this professor there. We had two professors. Professor number 1 was this guy who smoked a pipe in class because who cares? He's got tenure and he doesn't care what the policy says. And then you have this young person right out of seminary. He's all full of that new learning. And he's like, all right, we're going to use this book that my mother used when she was in seminary, to the point where she sent me her copy so I wouldn't have to buy it. And then the second woman goes, I want to talk to you about of this archaeological evidence that suggests that Yahweh was married to a female goddess named Ashera, because they found this in there. And so that, there's this whole notion that we might have lived in this polytheistic thing where God had a wife. And some people literally were like, I'm out. They literally, when the break happened, they didn't come back. And that was it. That was it for their entire seminary experience. Like, one hard challenge, the notion that perhaps Yahweh might have existed in the Old Testament in a polytheistic environment, which, by the way, did happen, that they couldn't stand it. And so they checked out because and I was like, I even thought to myself, like, I've not been in the church a lot, but I feel like that's the kind of fastball you're going to get with regularity from the congregants. Be like, hey, I watched this thing on A&E or Discovery Channel where it said this, and you're like, oh, well, I guess I'm out then. You just have to be able to be flexible and adapt to things and be able to have arguments and discussion that way. So anyways, sorry, I've gone on for a bit there, but there you go. That whole story about the guy leaving is absolutely true. Literally went out for a coffee break and never came back. He went and joined the Lutheran Missouri Synod. Anyways, fine people that they are. Other comments, questions? Roger's like, I'm just taking it in. Are there any questions online by chance? Just want to make sure in case it's up there. If you haven't. Nothing? Okay. If you do have a question, by the way, if you're watching online, you may feel free to go ahead and put that question in, and I will try to answer it in the context of that social media platform. About time. Anything else? Yes.
No, this is just a technical question because I'm interested. So what are your sources for column 2?
So there's a footnote there that says it's from the British New Testament Conference on Pauline authorship in 2012.
Can you read that far down? Thank you.
No problem. I sometimes I try to bring the receipts as best I can, especially on something specific like that.
No,
yes, Lisa.
It's really interesting. I'd never seen it before. It's
I actually have a
terrific.
graph if you want to see it, but it was a fascinating bit of scholarship because I think it really kind of crystallized this notion of the debate that exists with scholars about Pauline authorship. Lisa.
I've always been interested in Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus, and that's about all I know. Can you recommend anything to read about that, or do you have any comments you want to share about his conversion?
There are some scholars who think that story is reminiscent of other similar conversion stories that take place in other places in literature. although I think, my understanding of the scholarship is that a lot of them said, well, actually, those may have come after. It is certainly reminiscent of a lot of other prior theophanies that exist in Hebrew Scripture. Theophany is an appearance of God in which a person who claims to come from a humble, atypical origin has this extraordinary experience to which they are then called to a life of prophecy, to be a prophet. And really, if you actually look at a lot of the prophets, very few of them are kind of, well, even the apostles themselves, there's not a lot of people who came up through the institution who then were sort of, became excellent. A lot of times, God is pulling from the unexpected, the anti-hero, if you will. And so I think that this story has some of that to it. Paul is not the person you expect to be a Christian prophet, and yet seems to have this almost immediate conversion experience, and then which he then embraces wholeheartedly, and then ultimately goes to his death for. So I think there's something about that kind of radical intervention that resonates deeply with a lot of the story of people in Scripture, and also others in the history of the church who came in and said, you know what, I was a terrible person, and then God came into my life, and now I'm this. And so, in terms of recommending books, I'll have to go look. I've got a couple of books on Paul on my bookshelf. I'll see if I can find one for you. So, I'm always happy to get those off the shelf, and
Circular.
somebody gets to read them. So, any other comments or questions? Okay. Next up, I think I'm going to talk about the Gospels, sort of which I think are the next block of books that were written. And then I'll look at the non-Pauline epistles, and then I'll come back to this chart and kind of start filling in the numbers for. And then again, look at some of the letters that didn't make, or epistles or books that didn't make themselves into the Gospels, including some of the other Gospels that didn't make it, and some other letters that actually are sort of revered in the early church, but didn't make it, like the letters of Clement or the Shepherd of Hermas, or these things that you probably never even heard of because they didn't make the cut, but were sort of highly relevant letters in their day. So thank you all. And again, if you have any questions, I'm always happy to chat about this stuff, and that's true for those who are watching online. Drop me a note. I'm always happy to do it. Thank you for your time here. Thank you for those who are watching online. It's great to be a part of this. I love teaching.